The bells of the convent tolled for the last time. High in the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees shivered in the autumn wind, a small band of nuns gathered inside their fading chapel. They prayed beneath cracked frescoes, saints with faces long scraped away by age and sorrow. On the horizon, fire shimmered. Ottoman banners were already visible, red cloth fluttering like sparks across the mountains. The women knew exactly what that meant. No riders came from the nearby towns. No soldiers remained to guard them, only the stillness before conquest. Their abbess, Sister Eleni of Larissa, stood before the altar holding a silver crucifix that had survived a century of storms. She whispered, "If they breach our walls, keep your vows inside your hearts. That they cannot take." But she was wrong. When the empire's armies reached the convent gates, vows, prayers, and sanctity meant nothing against what history tried to erase. If you're drawn to documented records from the Ottoman-Byzantine frontiers, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more of the accounts buried in archives, from missionary letters to Vatican reports. Now, back to the story. The first stones of the convent collapsed before sundown. The hymns that once filled those halls were drowned out by iron and screams. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent wasn't sacred ground. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that the cross still dared to rise in conquered soil. Inside, the sisters hid their relics, silver chalices, embroidered icons, fragments of saint bones beneath the chapel floor. They believed, if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. But the soldiers weren't after treasure. They wanted evidence proof that they had crushed not just the enemy's armies, but their God. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were herded into the courtyard. Torchlight turned their white robes into shifting gold and shadow. They were told they'd be taken before the Pasha, a promise few ever lived to see fulfilled. What followed became legend, so grim that even church chroniclers avoided the details. By dawn, the convent was ash. Smoke drifted from the refectory, where the women once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags fluttered from the bell tower, signalling nearby units that resistance was over. Yet in that courtyard, something unexpected happened. The soldiers waiting for screams heard singing instead. Bound with rope, the surviving sisters began to chant, a hymn not of despair, but defiance. The Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices trembled, but never broke. The Ottoman captain, unsure whether to laugh or silence them, ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross rescued from the altar. The captain promised her mercy. If she renounced her God and accepted the conqueror's faith, her sisters would live. Her reply sealed her fate. "I have already given my life. What else can you take?" The captain hesitated, perhaps moved, then turned away, leaving her to his men. What followed was never written in full. Even Ottoman records, which glorified victory, described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. Yet in later European letters, her name resurfaced, Eleni of Larissa, the nun who would not kneel. By midday, the convent's bells were melted for coin and the rooftop cross shipped east as a trophy. But soon, rumours spread across nearby villages. They said that when the wind swept through the ruins at night, one could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely faded when the march began. What remained of the order, 22 women in torn habits, were driven south toward the coast, ankles bound, watched by Ottoman horsemen. To the empire, they weren't prisoners of war but symbols of conquest, proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was merciless. The sun scorched the road. The sisters, who had never stepped beyond their cloister, stumbled from thirst and exhaustion. When one fell, another lifted her veil so soldiers wouldn't trample it. A final act of dignity in a world stripped of mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her last words endured among them. "If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other." After 7 days of walking, the captives reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships designed not for comfort, but for control. The women were herded aboard, wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves once rode. As the sails caught the wind, the shores of Greece faded into the horizon, and with them, everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Yusuf Aga, kept meticulous records: cargo, spices, coins, textiles, and religious captives. It was this very ledger, discovered centuries later in the archives of Istanbul, that confirmed a story once dismissed as legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms lashed the deck, salt stung their wounds, hunger hollowed their faces. Yet what broke them most wasn't pain, it was silence. No one spoke to them except to bark commands. They existed like ghosts, floating between sky and sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the crashing waves. But even the chained prisoners around her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea seemed to still. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them, its domes and minarets glowing like blades in the dawn. Across the strait, the city seemed alive, breathing with power. For centuries, it had been called the City of the World's Desire. Now it would become their cage. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Locals paused to stare. Christian nuns among captives were a rarity, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient walls of Blakeney toward the imperial district where their fates would be sealed. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the once great cathedral of Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzin's calls echoed from the minarets, one of the sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns. This was not a dungeon, it was the Divan Humayun, the imperial council, where the will of the Sultan ruled above all. Here, captives were not judged by kings or priests, but by empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their faith would be measured against the laws of conquest. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, a man whose expression betrayed nothing. To his left, scribes waited with ink and parchment, ready to record every detail, names, ages, and intended uses. Every word would be entered into registers that still survive centuries later, stained by wax and time. The sisters stood in torn habits, eyes lowered. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy on one condition. Those who accepted conversion would be given new names, food, and life within the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean imprisonment or disappearance. None spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled. She had seen what happened to other captives brought before the vizier. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Damaris, stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay. "My lord," she said, "you may rename us, but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate such words. When he did, the vizier's face remained unreadable. Then he replied coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a motion of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would call it mercy, others would later call it something far worse. Some were given a different kind of prison, one disguised as service. Beneath the palace gardens lay a labyrinth of stone halls sealed from the sun. Each chamber had a thin slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were strict of their habits, clothed in rough garments, and told they would now serve, cleaning floors, sewing garments, feeding fires for the upper chambers. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude. But the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger, cold, and solitude were nothing new. For them, suffering was not punishment, it was devotion made real. Even in this subterranean prison, their discipline became armor. At night, they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed. They began counting days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call, not out of conversion, but as a defiant clock for faith that refused to die. Soon, whispers spread among the servants. There were stories of the Silent Sisters, foreign women buried beneath the palace who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed, others called them saints. Their silence echoed through the tunnels louder than prayer. Days bled into months. Their hands blistered from labor, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that gave heat to others, but none to them. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed time and hunger would bend even the strongest faith. That was when the next stage began, a test disguised as mercy. First came kindness. Food, oil, and silks were sent to their quarters. Learned men from the palace came to speak gently, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. "Your God and ours are not enemies," one imam said. "Take our tongue and you will be free." But they all understood what that freedom meant, erasing the memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and trembling, began to rise as their strength. She whispered fragments of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept them alive. Even incomplete, the word endured. When persuasion failed, the masks came off. The torches were doused, food cut in half, no more kind visits, only silence and darkness. One by one, they were taken to a narrow room where scribes waited. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused disappeared. It wasn't one grand act of cruelty, but a slow, methodical breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away by hunger, waiting, and the quiet voice asking, "Why suffer for a God who doesn't answer?" A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who remained, each disappearance hardened their resolve. Sister Damaris, once brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. "Call me Silence," she said. Her defiance spread like contagion. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness, and in that stillness, they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken: control. Official records mention them only in passing: foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else: living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes, deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned. And within those forgotten corridors, where no sunlight reached, the survivors found something unexpected: an old, sealed archway buried in dust and stone. At first, it was a hiding place, but slowly it became something sacred. They used broken pottery for candle holders, a scrap of linen for an altar cloth. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross. In this secret chapel, they gathered each night after the palace slept. No hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman knelt and shared a memory, a home, a church bell, the warmth of bread before dawn. These memories became their new psalms, small offerings to a God who still listened in the dark. A Venetian prisoner once wrote of strange voices echoing beneath the harem, women singing in Latin to a god, not of this empire. For centuries, historians dismissed it as superstition, until, beneath the Topkap ruins, archaeologists uncovered a small chamber lined with Christian carvings, silent proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into the stone. A Latin phrase, half erased by time, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. That small discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not simply vanished. They had left a mark, a silent revolt etched into the walls. Inside the hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once frail, now the center of their faith, began marking the walls with charcoal. Names could not be written openly, so she devised symbols instead: a bird for each sister still alive, a small flame for those who had been lost. Whenever a new bird failed to appear, it meant another had disappeared. The guards never uncovered the chapel, yet they began to notice subtle shifts in their captives. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the confinement, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. The overseers labelled it madness, but the scribes observing them recorded something else entirely. They had discovered a strength not of this world. Their secret worship continued for months, perhaps years, and though the empire tried to erase every trace of their existence, the chapel became their ultimate act of defiance. Not with weapons, not with protest, but through a faith that refused to die. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of the sisters remained, worn, aged, almost forgotten. Yet beneath the palace, their secret chapel endured, silent, hidden, eternal. Centuries later, when modern excavators explored Constantinople, no one expected that beneath layers of marble and empire, the fingerprints of these women would still be there. Women who had prayed in darkness, leaving behind the only thing the conquerors could never claim: their faith carved in stone. By 1482, the palace had changed hands again. A new sultan, young and ambitious, ascended the throne with orders to purge any trace of weakness from his predecessors. Every servant, concubine, and labourer was meticulously recorded, except one group. In the Topkapi archives, under columns of names, there was a blank space, a gap where 21 entries should have been. The ledger read, "Removed, unfit for service, disposed." No dates, no burial records, nothing. This was how history erased them, not with fire, but with withheld ink. And yet, the silence itself became proof. Only something shameful is hidden so carefully. Centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary surfaced in the archives of Bursa, cryptically mentioning foreign women who had refused to submit and disappeared beneath the palace foundations. Another letter, intercepted by Venetian spies in 1484, spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, these fragments revealed a truth the empire had tried to bury: the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. The last record of Sister Magdalena comes from decades later, written by an Italian pilgrim. He recounted a story whispered by a palace servant, a woman who sang to her god until the guards sealed the room. Her name was unknown, but the faint hymn he described survived the stone itself. In that echo, her story endured. Over time, tales of the vanished sisters became whispered rumours among slaves and servants. On certain full moon nights, the lower halls of the palace would grow cold, and the air smelled faintly of incense, though no fire burned. Memory, superstition, or both refused to die. Centuries later, European visitors drawn to the exotic mysteries of the Ottoman court heard fragments of the same legend. A French diplomat, writing in 1712, noted that among the older palace attendants persisted a forbidden story of Christian women who had sung themselves into heaven. He dismissed it as myth, yet the walls had already told the truth. The chapel lies in ruins now, but the carvings remain. Faded prayers etched into the walls, a whisper of women who refuse to be forgotten. In their silence, they still speak. And if you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you saw what they endured. And if you want more untold stories buried in the shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the darkness with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they hurt.